My fiance's wealthy family took one look at my sweet, simply dressed grandmother and assumed she was the hired help. They mocked her and ordered her around in their own kitchen. I finally had enough and stepped in to defend her. But a crisis was coming, and a professional chef hired for the party was about to recognize my grandmother not as a helper. This is a story about how some families judge by appearances and how true class is something money can't buy. Before we get into the drama, I'd love to know, what city are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. And be sure to subscribe for more stories every single day. Okay, let's head to that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. The invitation to Thanksgiving dinner at my fiancé Nathan's family home was, in his words, the final boss battle. I had been dating Nathan for over a year, and he had successfully managed to keep me separated from the formidable matriarchs of his family, his two wealthy, powerful, and notoriously snobby aunts, Beatrice and Cynthia. They were the gatekeepers of the family, and this dinner was to be my trial by fire. The day before, Nathan had called me in a panic. "Just be yourself, Amelia," he had said, which was immediately followed by a long list of ways I should, in fact, not be myself. Don't mention your parents are retired teachers. Just say they're in education. Don't talk about your volunteer work at the animal shelter. Try to talk about the stock market. And please, he had begged, wear the designer dress my mother bought you for your birthday, not one of your comfortable vintage ones. I had hung up the phone with a knot of dread in my stomach. The person he was asking me to be was a stranger to me, but I loved him, so I agreed to play the part. The real complication was my grandparents. I was their primary caregiver, and they were my entire world. I couldn't possibly leave them alone on Thanksgiving. After a long, tense negotiation, Nathan's family had grudgingly agreed that my grandparents, Evelyn and Samuel, could join us. My grandparents were the opposite of Nathan's family. They were warm, unpretentious, and their wealth was in their character, not their bank account. My grandmother, Evelyn, was the most incredible cook I had ever known, a woman who could turn simple ingredients into a feast. But she dressed for comfort in simple, elegant cardigans and comfortable shoes. She had no interest in designer labels. I knew, with a sinking feeling, that she would be judged instantly. The moment we arrived at their grand, intimidating mansion, my worst fears were realized. Beatrice and Cynthia greeted us at the door, their eyes doing a swift, brutal appraisal of my grandparents' simple yet respectable attire. They gushed over Nathan, gave me a cool air kiss near my cheek, and offered my grandfather a brisk handshake before their eyes landed on my grandmother. "And you must be Amelia's grandmother," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness. She didn't offer to take my grandmother's coat. Instead, she gestured vaguely down a hallway. "The kitchen is just through there if you'd like to make yourself comfortable." The insult was as subtle as a sledgehammer. She had assessed my grandmother's simple, non-designer dress and immediately categorized her as the help. My grandmother, a woman of immense grace, seemed not to even notice. She just smiled politely. "Thank you, dear. A busy kitchen is where I feel most at home." And she trotted off, happy to be near the action. I was horrified, but before I could say anything, Cynthia had taken my arm and was steering me into the formal living room, leaving my grandfather to be led away to the study with the other men. For the next hour, I was subjected to a polite but ruthless interrogation about my life, my career, my prospects. I felt like a bug under a microscope. I was so consumed with my own discomfort that I didn't realize what was happening in the kitchen. When I finally excused myself to use the restroom, I made a detour. The kitchen was a scene of controlled chaos. A professional catering team, hired by the aunts, was working frantically, and in the center of it all was my grandmother, Evelyn. But she wasn't sitting and observing. She had an apron on over her dress and was quietly, efficiently peeling a mountain of potatoes, her movements practiced and sure. And my fiancé's aunts were treating her exactly like a hired servant. "Be a dear and chop these onions for me, would you?" Cynthia said, pushing a cutting board towards her without even making eye contact. And be careful with that platter when you wash it, Beatrice added, pointing to a dish. It's antique Limoges porcelain. It's worth more than your car. My grandmother just nodded, her face a mask of serene calm, and continued to work. But I saw the flicker of hurt in her eyes. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. The years of my own quiet endurance of their snobbery was one thing, but I could not stand by and watch them humiliate the woman I loved and respected most in the world. I walked into the kitchen, a polite, cold smile on my face. Beatrice saw me and her expression soured. "Amelia, what are you doing in here? The guests are in the other room." "I just came to help my grandmother," I said, my voice clear and loud enough for the entire kitchen staff to hear. I took an apron from a hook and tied it around my waist. I walked over to my grandmother's side. "Honestly," Beatrice muttered to Cynthia, just loud enough for me to hear, "the quality of hired help these days is just appalling. Now we have their relatives wandering into the kitchen." I picked up a knife and an onion. I looked my future aunt-in-law directly in the eye. She is not the hired help. She is my grandmother. She is a guest in your home, and you will speak to her with respect. The kitchen went utterly silent. The professional caterers stopped what they were doing and stared. My fiancé's aunts looked at me, their faces a mask of pure, shocked outrage. I had just, on my very first family holiday with them, declared war. I had no idea that a looming crisis with the catering was about to give my quiet, unassuming grandmother the chance to end that war herself with a single, devastating move. The silence in the kitchen following my outburst was a sharp, brittle thing. My fiancé's aunts, Beatrice and Cynthia, stared at me, their faces a thunderous mask of pure, aristocratic outrage. They had been challenged, humiliated in their own home in front of the hired staff. I could see in their eyes that I had not just made an enemy, I had declared war I had no hope of winning. It was Beatrice who recovered first, her voice a low, venomous purr. "Well," she said, a thin, cruel smile playing on her lips as she looked me up and down, "it seems we have a misunderstanding of the house rules. Your grandmother," she said the word as if it were a strange, foreign object in her mouth, "is of course our esteemed guest. A guest who was simply so overcome with a desire to be helpful that she volunteered her time in the kitchen. How quaint." She had reframed my defense of my grandmother's dignity into a story of my grandmother's low-class eagerness to serve. It was a masterful, if monstrous, move. Without another word, she and Cynthia turned and swept out of the kitchen, leaving a toxic, icy atmosphere in their wake. The professional caterers, who had been frozen in place, suddenly found a renewed, intense interest in their cutting boards, refusing to meet my eye. I turned to my grandmother, Evelyn, my own face burning with a mixture of righteous fury and a new, dawning horror at what I had just done. "Grandma," I whispered, "I am so sorry. I shouldn't have lost my temper. I've just made everything worse." She was standing by the large stainless steel sink, calmly rinsing a bowl of potatoes. She looked up at me, and her eyes, the same warm, intelligent eyes I had known my entire life, were not full of fear or distress. They were full of a quiet, fierce pride. She dried her hands on her apron and took my trembling hand in hers. Her skin was soft, her grip surprisingly strong. "Nonsense, Amelia, my dear," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor in my emotional storm. "You did not make things worse. You made them honest. Some people," she glanced towards the swinging door through which the aunts had just departed, "build their entire lives on a foundation of polite cruelty. Sometimes you have to be a little impolite to remind them that cruelty is not a virtue. She gave my hand a final, reassuring squeeze. Now, I believe these potatoes still need peeling. Let's make ourselves useful. And so we did. My silent sacrifice, my act of defiance, was to stay. Instead of rejoining the party in the grand living room, where I knew I would now be the subject of hushed, scandalized whispers, I chose to remain in the servants' quarters. I stayed in the kitchen with my grandmother. We took our place at a small, out-of-the-way prep station, and we worked. We peeled potatoes, we chopped vegetables, we worked together in a comfortable, familiar silence, a two-person island of quiet dignity in the hostile territory of my fiancé's family. We were not guests, we were not servants, we were a team. The real crisis, however, was brewing on the other side of the kitchen. The head chef, a man with a suitably fancy chef's coat and a perpetually stressed expression, was in charge of the Thanksgiving dinner's centerpiece, a series of perfectly roasted ducks with a complex and notoriously difficult cherry and port wine reduction sauce. He was a good chef, but the pressure of cooking in a private home under the constant, critical supervision of my fiancé's aunts was clearly getting to him. The first sign of trouble was the phone call. I saw the chef step into the pantry, his voice a low, panicked whisper. When he emerged, his face was pale. "Family emergency," he announced to his young, terrified-looking sous chef. "My son, I have to go. You can handle the rest, right? Just watch the sauce. Don't let it break." And then he was gone, leaving the young, overwhelmed second-in-command to face the culinary storm alone. The young man, who couldn't have been more than 20, did his best, but the panic was rolling off him in waves. And then it happened, a moment of inattention. The smell of scorching sugar filled the kitchen. He had burned the sauce. A deep, black, acrid crust was forming at the bottom of the pan. With a panicked yelp, he threw the ruined sauce into the sink and immediately started a new batch. But his confidence was shattered. His hands were shaking, he added the port wine too quickly, and it wouldn't reduce properly. The aunts, Beatrice and Cynthia, sensing disaster, swept back into the kitchen, their faces masks of impending social doom. "What is going on in here?" Beatrice demanded. "Where is Chef Antoine?" He had to leave, ma'am. A family emergency." "And the sauce?" Cynthia asked, peering into his pan with a look of disgust. "It looks like purple water. Dinner is supposed to be served in 30 minutes. This is a catastrophe. You are ruining my Thanksgiving." They descended upon the poor boy like two perfectly coiffed vultures, berating him, questioning his every move, their frantic, unhelpful energy making the situation 100 times worse. The boy was on the verge of tears, his culinary training completely deserting him in the face of their assault. It was into this swirling vortex of chaos that my grandmother, Evelyn, moved. She had been watching the entire scene from her quiet prep station, her expression calm and analytical. She wiped her hands on her apron, walked over to the main stove, and picked up a clean tasting spoon from the counter. She dipped the spoon into the watery, pathetic-looking sauce and took a small taste. She closed her eyes for a moment, her expression unreadable, then she opened them. She looked at the weeping sous chef, at the panicking aunts, and at the array of ingredients on the counter. She turned to the young, defeated chef. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the chaos with the clean, sharp authority of a well-honed blade. "Give me that," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable confidence. "You're trying to reduce it too quickly on too high a heat. You've broken the emulsion." She picked up a small bowl of cherries. "And you're using the wrong acid." She then looked at a stick of butter sitting on the counter. "And that butter is far too warm." The sous chef, and my fiancé's aunts, just stared at her, their mouths agape. They had no idea they were about to receive a masterclass in French culinary technique from the quiet old woman they had mistaken for the help. My grandmother, Evelyn, stood in the center of the chaotic, steam-filled kitchen, a small, unassuming woman in a simple dress and a borrowed apron. And yet, in that moment, she commanded the room with an authority more absolute than any five-star general. The young, terrified sous chef, my fiancé's panicking aunts, and the array of ingredients on the counter, they all fell silent, their eyes fixed on her. My Aunt Beatrice, recovering from her initial shock, was the first to speak. "And just who do you think you are?" she snapped, her voice a low hiss of pure aristocratic outrage. "This is a professional kitchen. You have no right." My grandmother did not even grant her a glance. She spoke only to the young, defeated sous chef, her voice quiet but firm, a calm, steady island in a sea of hissing pans and hysterical hostesses. "Breathe, son," she said, her tone kind but with an undercurrent of steel. "First, kill the heat. You're scorching the port before the alcohol has a chance to burn off. That's why your sauce is bitter." The young man, startled by the calm, professional command, obeyed instinctively, his hand reaching out to lower the flame on the gas stove. "Good," my grandmother continued. She picked up a lemon from the counter. "You're trying to balance the sweetness of the cherries with more sugar. You're fighting fire with fire. You don't need more sugar. You need acid. It will cut the sweetness and brighten the flavor." She then pointed a finger at a stick of butter that was softening on the counter. "And that butter is far too warm. It will melt instantly and break your emulsion. Get it back in the freezer now." "But Chef Antoine said," the young man began to stammer. "I have a great deal of respect for Chef Antoine's roasting technique, but his sauce work has always been a little pedestrian. Now, are you going to listen to me, or are you going to serve our guests roasted duck with a side of purple sugary disappointment?" The sous chef just stared at her, his jaw slack, and then, with a look of dawning awe, he began to move, following her instructions with a new, desperate energy. Beatrice and Cynthia just stood on the sidelines, their arms crossed, their faces a mask of pure, baffled fury. They were watching the hired help they had been bullying just moments before completely take over their expensive, high-stakes dinner party, and their brains simply could not process it. What followed was a masterclass. I watched, completely mesmerized, as my grandmother transformed. The quiet, gentle woman I knew was replaced by a culinary artist in her element. Her movements were a blur of a lifetime of practice. She minced the shallots with a speed and a precision that was a work of art. She deglazed the pan with a confident flick of her wrist, the resulting plume of steam smelling not of burnt sugar, but of rich, aromatic port. She was not just cooking, she was conducting a symphony of flavors, explaining every step to the young sous chef, who was now watching her with the wide-eyed reverence of a true disciple. "You see?" she said, whisking a small knob of the now frozen butter into the sauce at the very last second. The cold butter emulsifies into the sauce without melting. It gives it that beautiful, glossy sheen, that perfect velvety texture. She finished, and the sauce was a masterpiece. It was a deep, rich, and glossy river of ruby-red perfection. She dipped a tasting spoon in, took a small sip, and gave a single, satisfied nod. She then handed the pan and the spoon to the young sous chef. "There," she said. "Now you can serve your ducks." He took the spoon, his own hand trembling slightly. He tasted the sauce. The reaction was immediate. His eyes, which had been full of panic and despair, now widened with pure, unadulterated shock and delight. It was not just saved, it was 1,000 times better than the original recipe. "Ma'am," he stammered, looking at my grandmother as if she were a god. How did you do that? That technique, the cold butter finish. I've only ever read about it in one book. It's a classic, almost forgotten, Escoffier method." My grandmother smiled, a small, gentle smile. "It is," she said. "My own grandmother taught it to me a long time ago." The young man just stared at her, his mind clearly racing, trying to connect the dots. He looked at her simple, unassuming dress, and then at her hands, at the way she held the pan, the way she understood the heat. And then a look of dawning, impossible recognition crossed his face. "Vance," he whispered, his voice full of a sudden, shocked awe. You have to be. Are you Evelyn Vance? From the legendary Vance Catering? The author of Foundations of Flavor?" The name dropped into the now silent kitchen like a bomb. My aunts, Beatrice and Cynthia, who had been watching from the corner, frozen in a state of confused fury, both let out a small, collective gasp. Vance Catering wasn't just a catering company. It was a legend in their high society world for over 30 years, the absolute gold standard for the most exclusive parties and galas in the state. And its founder, the reclusive and famously private Evelyn Vance, was a culinary icon, a myth. My grandmother, the woman they had mistaken for a clumsy, low-class hired helper, the woman they had ordered around and mocked in her own granddaughter's presence, just smiled her quiet, gentle smile. "I've been retired for a decade, young man," she said to the starstruck sous chef, "but I suppose some things you never forget." I looked at my fiancé's aunts. Their faces, which had been so full of arrogant certainty, had completely and totally crumbled. They weren't just embarrassed. They weren't just humiliated. They were looking at my grandmother with a look of pure, soul-shattering horror. They had not just insulted a guest. They had not just bullied an old woman. They had committed a social crime of such epic proportions in front of witnesses that their own carefully constructed reputations were now in absolute ruins. Just then, the butler, Henderson, appeared at the kitchen door, his face a mask of professional calm. "Madam," he said to Beatrice, "the guests are becoming restless. They are asking when dinner will be served." My Aunt Beatrice just stared at him, her face pale, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. She had been so worried about her perfect Thanksgiving dinner being ruined by a bad sauce. She had no idea that her real disaster, the one she could never ever recover from, had only just begun. The silence in the kitchen following the sous chef's starstruck revelation was a profound and beautiful thing. My fiancé's aunts, Beatrice and Cynthia, stood frozen by the pantry door, their faces a ghastly, pale canvas of pure, unadulterated horror. The legendary Evelyn Vance, the culinary icon whose exclusive parties they had spent years trying to get into, the author whose cookbook sat pristine and unread on their marble countertops as a status symbol, was the same quiet, simply dressed woman they had just spent the last hour treating like an incompetent, low-class servant. The social and karmic implications of their blunder were so catastrophic, so total, that their minds had simply shut down. They were statues of shame. My grandmother, Evelyn, however, did not gloat. She was a professional. With a quiet, authoritative grace, she turned back to the now devoted sous chef. "Well," she said, her voice a calm, steady instrument that cut through the tension, "the guests are waiting. Let's not disappoint them." For the next 10 minutes, she orchestrated the plating of the main course with the effortless precision of a symphony conductor. She guided the young, adoring kitchen staff, her instructions quiet, clear, and brilliant. My aunts did not move. They just stood there, trapped in the corner of the kitchen, forced to watch the woman they had just humiliated command their own kitchen with a level of mastery they could only dream of. When it was time to return to the dining room, my grandmother untied her apron, smoothed down her simple dress, and took my arm. "Shall we, dear?" she whispered, a small, mischievous twinkle in her eye. We walked out of the kitchen and back to our seats at the dining table, a united front of quiet, unshakable dignity. Beatrice and Cynthia shuffled out behind us like two disgraced ghosts returning to their haunting grounds. The dinner that followed was a masterpiece of excruciating, delicious tension. The roasted duck, served with my grandmother's perfect glossy cherry and port wine reduction sauce, was the best thing I had ever tasted, and I was not alone. The moment the guests took their first bite, a chorus of unrestrained, rapturous praise filled the room. "Beatrice, my God, this sauce is divine. It's the best thing your chef has ever made." Beatrice, who was pushing the food around her plate, her face still pale, could only manage a weak, trembling smile. "Yes," she choked out, he's outdone himself tonight." But my grandfather, Samuel, a man of simple tastes but profound integrity, was not about to let the lie stand. He beamed with a pride so immense it seemed to light up his end of the table. "Oh, the chef didn't make this," he announced cheerfully to the entire table. "My Evelyn did. She had to step in and save the day when the hired help had a little mishap." Every eye at the table now turned to my grandmother, their expressions a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Evelyn, you made this?" someone asked. And so the interrogation began. But this time, the subject was not my humble life, but my grandmother's legendary one. Spurred on by my grandfather's proud questions, she told stories. She spoke of the time she had catered a private dinner for a visiting president, of the logistical nightmare of preparing a 5-course meal for a royal wedding, of her philosophy that the best ingredients are always local and seasonal. I watched, mesmerized, as the woman I had always known as my loving, quiet grandmother transformed into Evelyn Vance, the culinary titan. She was not bragging, she was simply sharing the stories of her life's passion. And the entire table, including my fiancé's father and his business partners, were utterly captivated. Beatrice and Cynthia were forced to sit there, in silence, at their own perfectly set table and listen to the woman they had scorned became the undeniable star of their own party. Every word of praise from my grandmother was a fresh, hot coal of humiliation for them. Every story of her success was a testament to their own profound, and now very public, foolishness. The final, beautiful blow came at the end of the meal. The young sous chef, his confidence now restored, came out from the kitchen to clear the plates. He stopped at the head of the table. "Mrs. Prescott," he said, his voice full of a genuine professional respect. But he was not looking at Beatrice. He was looking at my grandmother. "On behalf of the entire kitchen staff," he said, "thank you. It was an honor to cook with you tonight. I learned more in the last hour than I have in the last 2 years of culinary school." He then looked at me. "And I must also thank you, Amelia," he said. "Your grandmother is a legend, but you clearly inherited her palate. If you hadn't noticed that the wine for the first batch of sauce was stored too close to the oven and had turned, I never would have figured out why the emulsion kept breaking. You saved me from a complete disaster." The entire table now turned to look at me, their eyes wide with a new respect. The quiet, simple girl was not so simple after all. My fiancé, Nathan, had been watching this entire drama unfold, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to a dawning, horrified understanding of his own aunt's behavior. He had been silent for most of the meal, just watching me, watching my grandmother. Now he stood up, a wine glass in his hand. He didn't look at his aunts. He didn't look at his parents. He looked directly at me. "I think," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the silent room, "that I have been a complete and utter fool. I have been so worried about the wrong things." He looked at my grandmother, then back to me, "and I have some very, very serious apologizing to do." He raised his glass. "To Amelia," he said, his voice full of a new, profound, and deeply humbled respect. "And to her incredible family." The dinner was over. The performance was complete. And my fiancé's family, who had started the evening so certain of their own superiority, had just been served a lesson in humiliation that was far more bitter than any burnt sauce. Nathan's toast, his simple, heartfelt words, "To Amelia and to her incredible family," hung in the silent, tension-filled dining room. It was not just a toast, it was a declaration, a public shifting of allegiance. He was no longer just a member of his family. He was a member of mine. The look of utter, betrayed shock on his aunts' faces was a sight to behold. They had lost him. In that single public moment, they had lost control. The rest of the dinner was a masterclass in quiet, agonizing humiliation for them. The beautiful roasted duck, saved from ruin by my grandmother's expert hands, was served, and it was, of course, a masterpiece. The room was filled with a chorus of compliments, but none of them were directed at the hostesses, Beatrice and Cynthia. They were all directed at my quiet, unassuming grandmother. "Evelyn, this is the best duck I have ever tasted in my life." Nathan's father, a man who had barely acknowledged her existence earlier, boomed from across the table. "You must give our chef the recipe." "Oh, I couldn't possibly," my grandmother replied with a gentle, humble smile. "It's an old family secret." My grandfather, Samuel, beamed with a pride so profound it seemed to make him sit taller. He spent the rest of the meal prompting my grandmother to tell stories from her long and storied career in catering, stories I knew my fiancé's aunts had heard whispers of, but had always dismissed as exaggerated tales from the help. Now, they were forced to sit in silence and listen as the woman they had tried to bully was revealed to be a culinary titan, a legend in the very high society world they so desperately tried to dominate. Their perfect Thanksgiving, the one they had so carefully curated to showcase their own superiority, had been completely and totally hijacked, and the hijackers were the quiet, simple country folk they had so thoroughly misjudged. The departure was a quiet, formal affair. The warmth and chaos of a typical family holiday was gone, replaced by a strained, cold politeness. As we stood in the grand foyer putting on our coats, my fiancé's aunts could not even bring themselves to look at me or my grandmother. They just offered a stiff, almost silent goodbye. Their defeat was absolute. The car ride home was quiet at first, the four of us lost in our own thoughts. Then, Nathan, who was driving, reached over and took my hand. "Amelia," he began, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher, "I am so sorry." "It's not your fault, dear," my grandmother said gently from the back seat. "No, it is," he insisted, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. "It's my fault for being a coward. I knew what they were like. I was so afraid of their judgment, so obsessed with you making a good impression, that I almost let them ruin everything. I almost let them disrespect the most wonderful people I have ever met. Tonight I saw what real class, what real strength looks like, and it has nothing to do with money or a fancy house. It's you. It's your family." His apology was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. The weeks that followed were a quiet realignment of our family's universe. The story of what happened at Thanksgiving, of the legendary Evelyn Vance being mistaken for a hired hand by her own hostesses, became a delicious piece of gossip in their wealthy social circle. Beatrice and Cynthia's reputation for being arbiters of taste and class was shattered, replaced by a new reputation for being foolish, arrogant snobs. A few months later, Nathan came to me with a business proposal. He told me he had done a lot of thinking. He was tired of his family's world of abstract finance and social posturing. He wanted to build something real. He wanted to use a portion of his own trust fund to open a small, authentic, family-run bistro. He wanted to call it Evelyn's Table, and he wanted my grandmother to be the consulting chef and me to be his partner in running it. And so, our vindication was not a single, explosive moment of revenge. It was a slow, beautiful, and constructive act of building. It's been a year now. The grand opening of Evelyn's Table is tonight. The space is beautiful, warm, and inviting, filled with the scent of my grandmother's incredible cooking. My grandfather, Samuel, is the proud host at the door. My grandmother, Evelyn, is holding court in the kitchen, a queen in her true element. My fiancé, my partner, Nathan, is at the bar, his face full of a joy and a purpose I had never seen in him before. And I am managing it all, a proud business owner, a happy fiancé, a loving granddaughter. My fiancé's aunts were not invited. I looked around at our bustling, happy restaurant, at this beautiful thing we had all built together. My aunts had tried to relegate me and my grandmother to the status of kitchen help, and now, a year later, the kitchen is where we have found our greatest success, our purest joy, and our most profound victory. My vindication was not improving them wrong. It was improving that my own family's values, authenticity, hard work, kindness, and a love passed down through generations, were infinitely more valuable and ultimately more successful than their superficial, empty obsession with status. An absolutely beautiful and heartwarming story about the triumph of true class and character. What do you think of the way Evelyn, the grandmother, handled the situation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this satisfying story of a family's quiet vindication, please show your support by hitting that like button, and be sure to subscribe for more powerful and emotional stories. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.